Well, welcome, all you wiretappers out there. Back here in the COVID-19 virus studio, Gangland Wire, with my good friend Cam Robinson up in Munster, Indiana, on the other end. Now, this show here, Dan Bashford of Sydney, Australia. I want you to listen up. Dan's been one of our regular supporters, and we've had quite a few emails back and forth that comparing what's going on in Australia and what's going on in the United States. They've already lived through those fires. He had to live through that. Said they had smoke coming into Sydney and everything, and really devastated that southwest part of Australia. And they just were getting through that when the COVID virus thing hit, and they're all locked down in Australia too. Cam, welcome.
Gary, I'm glad to be here. As always, I'm quarantined, so I'm glad to have
something to do. Oh, really? Me too. I've been knocking these out like crazy. I did two yesterday. One with a motorcycle gang member from Canada. Yesterday was all Canada Day. Then there's a true crime writer named Nate Henley from up in Canada, and I did another one with him. We did kind of a fun one about the boring life of a mobster. So anyhow, we'll moving right along. We're going to talk about, Dan, this is for you and all the podcast fans in Australia. This is going to be about the Drangheta in Australia. And I think I pronounced that right, didn't I, Cam?
Yeah, that was good. I probably overpronounced it, but yeah, that was yeah.
That was one of the harder words for me to learn at the start. I did a whole show on the different Camorra and the Drangheta. I think I just finally just said, it's that long word that starts with an N, probably. That was a long time ago. I ought to go back in and find that one and take it down. I'm kind of embarrassed over myself because it's not really that hard to say. I just need to learn how to say it. So, go all the way back. It started a little later in Australia than it did in the United States. It was first reported in Australia in 1922. Now, quickly it took hold, and there was probably a large group of Sicilians that arrived in Australia in 1922. Actually, there was a large group of Calabrians that arrived in Australia in 1922, because if you're in the Drangheta, you're probably from and I just forgot the Calabrian region of
Calabria,
Sicily,
down the very southern tip, sort of the toe of the boot.
Right, all the way down. That whole southern section of Italy down below Rome, Naples and Calabria, and then Sicily. That must have been the northern Italians must have really kept them down, and because you have a lot of poor people, and it's out of those poor neighborhoods that the government wasn't treating right, that the mafia and these kinds of organizations started to protect their own.
I think that's a good observation. Yeah.
But the Calabrian immigrants quickly established control over local produce markets in Melbourne was where they first arrived. Sicilians had been there earlier, and they didn't really appreciate the competition, and there was a 15-year battle with the Calabrians, which they would eventually win.
Yeah.
I guess the Sicilians must have set their sights more on the United States anyhow during the 20s and 30s, because Prohibition was on over here, and there was a lot of money to be made over here, and that they knew that back in Sicily.
Right. That seems to be what happened. I think these were sort of satellite operations that came out, sort of explorers looking for new territory, and it sounds like the Calabrians were the victors.
One of their first really big deals where they came to light, and we had something like this down in New Orleans. We can't remember the names, but there was a December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1925, Constable James Clare was stabbed to death after he approached and tried to break up a group of 8 to 12 Italian men engaged in a fight. They accused a particular man named Domenico Candello, and the local boss of the Drangheta, Antonio Barbaro, and remember that name, Barbaro, paid his bail. He was one of the early bosses, and that whole Barbaro family will last all the way up to present time. we had this deal in New Orleans. The same kind of a thing happened. Some people
David
who were
Hennessy.
just, what's that?
David Hennessy was the
David
cop.
Hennessy was the policeman who was killed by what they thought were black handers or somebody
Mhm.
connected with the black hand. They put several of them in jail, and the Southerners down there, they broke into jail and just like the old West days, and took all those old Mustache Pete's out. They were probably young Mustache Pete's at the time, and hung them. So it's it's a different world back there in the teens and the 20s, wasn't it, Cam?
Little bit more draconian, I
Really, everything was more draconian. Now, by 1930, law enforcement found some letters that detailed the Ndrangheta codes and rituals, and we also know today that rules are really important to these Ndrangetas. Now, Ndrangetas will be divided up into cells, and they're not really in pyramid form like La Cosa Nostra tends to like a pyramid form. Each cell will be handled independently. They
Right.
operate independently. Now there's a council back in Sicily. I mean, there's a council back in Calabria that may step in or may be consulted at times and has
Right.
to approve of major things. But other than that, each one of these cells are operate independently, which is kind of why they have problems. I think they're divided into 6 cells: South Australia, Northwest Wales, not Northwest,
South
New
Wales.
New South
New,
Wales, I think it is. Is that what it is,
yeah,
NSW?
South,
Let me
New
get that
South.
again.
Yeah, that's
Uh, uh, Australia is divided up into 6 cells by the Ndrangheta. South Australia, New South Wales, Canberra, or that Canberra, I'm not sure, Griffin, Adelaide, and Melbourne. Then
yeah.
there's
I think
7.
that's something they do everywhere. There's always going to be 6 cells wherever they go. Is kind of what it sounds like. How they keep the peace within themselves. It's kind of a, like you said, discipline.
Yeah, I read that there's 6 cells in Calabria in Italy, and if they
Right.
move somewhere else, I imagine if you look into it, there's going to be 6 cells of Drangheta families in Canada, because they have a little bit more of a presence in Canada.
Oh,
There's hardly, I don't know if there's any real presence anymore, or even lasted up to prohibition in the United States.
it doesn't seem to be really.
And there's 7 families in Adelaide at the time. The Sergis, the Barbaros, remember that name, Trombolis, Romeos, Nirta, Alvaro, Per, and these are all the oldest families that are over there. And uh,
You see
they
these names crop up a lot.
yeah, all through the years. Gone up into the 1950s, of course, they get established in the 30s, and gambling and preying off of the other Italian shopkeepers, and but nothing happens during World War II in the organized crime era. Have you noticed that? There's this
Yeah.
big gap, 1939, 1940, about 1950. There's hardly anything
Oh,
happening
yeah, that's right.
in the organized crime circles. Very few stories, or wasn't anything going on.
Right.
1951, there was a severe flooding in Calabria. Uh, that caused a lot more immigration to Australia during the 1950s.
Yeah, that's really where the Calabrians developed a real strong presence. It just from what I was reading, it was just the whole town basically emptied that town Piatti and ended up in Australia. So it was just a mass exodus.
No,
That's
in Piatti, Calabria.
yeah,
Interesting. And they were all farmers apparently, because I understand, if I remember right, they bought up large tracts of land, started growing produce. Italians, historically, it must be a good place to grow produce over in
yeah.
Italy, because there's a long tradition. When they came to the United States, when they came to Kansas City, first thing they got involved in, if it wasn't a restaurant, it was working in the city market with produce, and having produce carts, and working with commercial companies that were getting produce out to the grocery stores. And so produce is a big deal, and it was a huge deal down there with these Drangheta families.
I know in Philadelphia the city market is the Italian region, and that's
Yeah.
still so that supports what you say.
Of course, as usual, a lot of these people are not criminals that came from collaborating. They're not all criminals. Sometimes we make that mistake, don't we?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
could I could understand why Italians get a little tired of us reporting on organized crime like all Italians. If you're Italian, you must be a member of the mob.
My great grandfather used to say, "Mafia," and spit on the floor. He
Yeah.
was not a fan.
At one time here in Kansas City, they at, at one time here in Kansas City, the head of the strike force was Mike DeFeo, and the two lead agents of the FBI in the one squad, or the organized crime squad, were Leone Flossi and Bill Owsley, both of whom were Italian. Flossi was even born in Italy, so so you can't just stamp people out with one cookie cutter, can you?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I know that in America you had a lot of anti-Italian prejudice just with all groups that came here, and from what I was reading in Australia, that's sort of the same kind of backlash after certain crimes. There was a lot of negative feeling towards immigration, and it's just a sign of the times where you assign it to the group, like we're saying.
Yeah. So during the 1960s, they pretty well have control of all the produce markets that Drangheta does, because even if you're not involved, once they get their foothold in anything, they're gonna want to control everything, and they'll extort money from other grocers. Call them green grocers. There's my understanding.
Yeah,
We don't
yeah,
really use that here.
green grocer, I guess, is what what we think of as like the farmers market. They call it the green grocer.
Here's one where they used their farming. This by the 1960s, marijuana's got immensely popular, and one of the families of Trimbolis starts planting marijuana plants, that really good marijuana out of Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Starts planting the plants in between the trees and the different fruit plants, and so you'll easily hide that from outsiders' view, and then you can go in and harvest your marijuana when it's time, and then store it again with your other produce. So
that was and they controlled all of the produce market because they bought up all these lands and they had their own people farming, and they basically took over the marketplace. If you're a farmer who's not Calabrian, if you're not an approved farmer, if you're not paying your protection money to the local Calabrians, you're just not gonna your fruit stand is gonna be torn down, or you're just not gonna have a stand. You show up with your produce in the morning, and we don't have a place for you. You're gonna have to go somewhere. So by controlling the land and by controlling the markets, they took it over. And then once they had that land, they just they had plenty of places to and a farming situation set up to just plant all that marijuana. And that Aussie Bob Trimboli was really the guy, and that Trimboli name was one of the old. But yeah, I mean, millions of dollars worth of marijuana in the 60s that this guy was 60s and 70s that he was growing. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of marijuana.
Looks like they even had a little mob war during this time. In 1963, there was a guy named Vincenzo Anguletta who started what you would call a rival grocery confederation, which probably means that he got a bunch of the other green grocers together to have their own action going, more than likely, and he gets murdered for his trouble. 1964, a Vincenzo Murato, there's a tongue twister. 1964, Vincenzo
Muratore.
Muratore.
Let me see. Yeah, Muratore. Yeah. They went after him in retaliation. So yeah, I mean that's. I think it's probably like when you get union groups, like what they were talking about in the Irish movie, where you had that Casalito, Three Fingers Casalito, and he was starting up being a rival union boss.
Yeah,
have that. So.
There's always going to be rivals, isn't there? And that was our last mob war in Kansas City. It was two rival factions, basically, or the ruling faction and then a sub faction in between, and that's exactly what always happens. Well, this Trimboli, Aussie Bob, they called him. He kind of Americanized or Australianized himself.
He said he had a
Aussie Bob.
real thick accent. Actually, that's what they said. That's why they called him Aussie Bob, because he had such a thick accent.
He would graduate to be really basically the head of all drug trafficking in Australia. And you know, Cam he had some vending machine repair shops and restaurants, and then the produce company or produce business. But he had a yacht, and his yacht was named Cannabis. Now that's throwing it right in the face of the police, isn't it?
I mean, that's taking a stand. That's daring them.
Who was that New Jersey mobster? He had a boat down in Florida, and the name of it was The Usual Suspects.
It was Scarpa.
Scarpa, yeah.
Scarpa.
Our mob guys always kept a real low profile, real nondescript cars, no personalized license plates except one who ended up dead, and he had his name on his license plate, Spiro. And I've got a picture of a policeman bending over in front of that Cadillac with that Spiro license plate number as he's working the crime scene where Mr. Spiro was blown up, clear up out through the roof of the used car shack that he had on his used car lot, and dumped him down in the middle of the parking lot.
I think they said that was Carlo Gambino's one luxury is, and I've seen pictures. His license plate said Carlo.
I think I do remember reading that. I forgot about
They said
that.
that was his one. That was his one little thing. That was what the old man did.
I think I'll get one that says Tony Soprano on it. How about that?
That's right.
I bet you can make those up, just those fake license plates, and sell them all over the place.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to have a front tag that says Tony Soprano on it. You don't get any tickets, parking tickets, and nobody will ever break into your car.
That's right.
You know, we had a rumor around here, and I'm curious, all you wiretappers out there, especially you guys that grew up in big cities, was there ever a thing that if you tie a red ribbon around your steering column or around your door handle, that the local thieves knew this was a connected car and they'd never break into it or steal it? We had that in Kansas City.
Really?
I worked a mob murder once, and that guy had was found in his car, and he had a red ribbon tied around his steering column.
Shit. Yeah, I've not heard anything like that in Chicago, but you'd think there would have to be some kind of identification.
Yeah, I bet there is other things just like that out there. So now the government is getting fired up about these guys by the 1970s. You know, it's probably just like in the United States. Law enforcement was somewhat corrupt or a little more corrupt in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then in the 60s, everything starts changing. And really, like when all the baby boomers were the young guys going on to police departments and going into prosecutors' offices and getting those kinds of positions, they were not as subject to corruption for some reason as their predecessors. And we had an anti-drug politician named Donald McKay, and he got into this whole marijuana smuggling operation of Trimboli's. I'm not sure exactly how he did it, but he
told them where the land was. You know, he said, I know that if you go to this land, you will find a massive amount of marijuana. He was really didn't like them messing up his little hometown of Griffith. And so he told the cops.
Oh, that's right. Okay, up in Griffith. Okay, and that was this Aussie Bob Trimboli's operation.
Yeah. It was a poor decision.
He got found out, and for some reason, when they were giving evidence in court, they read his name out loud as being the source. He probably, being a prominent politician, he probably had a constituent come to him and say, hey, you know, I know where this stuff is, as he was dealing with these people.
Yeah.
Had seized $25 million worth of marijuana.
Yeah.
By July the 15th, that was just a few months later, Donald McKay disappeared. And this was another of those Blanca Luparas. They never found his body.
Yeah, they found a car, 2 shell casings, and a little bit of blood on the door. And that was the last of Donald McKay.
Which, of course, that law enforcement had a huge overreaction to that one. And I've talked about that before, how law enforcement reacts when criminals take out one of their own, which has happened so few times that I only know one time, and it was more of an accident, or it was a street robbery that went bad. But boy, I tell you what, and we had a couple of policemen get shot in the line of duty, in the middle of interrupting a robbery, and believe me, those streets were not safe for man or beast for a while till those people got in.
Yeah,
there was the same with FBI agent.
There was a bomb found on a cop's doorstep here in Chicago, and I think it was in the middle of that the car wars and the
chop shop wars. I remember that.
Chop shop wars. And they hit the roof. So within a couple weeks, a guy whose name was the bomber, who was one of the rivals, he shows up dead, and they're like, "Look, we took care of it. We got rid of the bomber."
Yeah, that was probably handwriting. I took care of it. He was the mafia-owned commander of detectives at one time. I mean, totally mobbed on. He was so mobbed on that he had a jewelry robbery crew out there operating for him.
He had the market cornered.
Yes, he did. He was unbelievable. So by the 80s, they get into cocaine smuggling with Sicilians. It's the second mafia war here. Do you remember anything about that? That was that Salvatore Reina.
That was Reina. Well, he was
Reina, who was called the Beast, that got caught up with Gaetano Badalamenti and some of those, and Tommaso
Buscetta. Yeah.
That was the second mafia war.
Yeah. So while they're raging, the Calabrians step in and took over their routes from South America and took over their shipping routes to all over the place. And the Sicilians, they never gained their footage back after that. Reina really, really cut off the legs of the Sicilian mafia after that.
Yeah, that would be a huge business, especially in the 1980s, to lose the cocaine business into all of Australia. And they got, two major metropolitans or three major metropolitans areas and cocaine. Yeah, well, you know how much money has been made in cocaine. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah. And you can see there were some major drug rings in the 70s that did not involve the Ndrangheta, and the only it was before that war. So you had the Golden Triangle down there, and that was a big heroin thing through Sydney. And the Ndrangheta did not have anything to do with that, but then you see immediately in the next decade, they've moved over, they've pushed out all the competition, and they own the drug market. So they're bringing heroin directly in, but they've also got that cocaine market. So there was no competition after that.
Now, did they have to do much to hang on to that? Was what happened on up into the 80s? Looks like they had a little bit of a conflict here in the 80s. There was a Melbourne boss named Ben Benito. His car was bombed at the wholesale market at the greengrocer market.
Yeah, that was somebody sending a message. He was the big boss though. But Benvenuto, if I'm right, he had a daughter, and his daughter was married to a guy named Dominic Marifiotti. And Marifiotti was stepping out on his wife, which was accepted. These guys, even though she was the boss's daughter, these guys tend to have girlfriends. The problem is he moved out and he moved in with his girlfriend. He wanted to divorce his wife, which is not allowed. That's not allowed with these traditional Italians. So he disappeared. He was also a greengrocer, which I think was probably like being a union official. Is kind of what I get. He disappears. They said maybe he was leaking information, but I think that's just sort of the stock thing. But he disappeared, and then is oh shit. You know what? God damn it. You gotta. I'm talking about the wrong guy, Gary.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Right, let me make a note of where that is in this thing. We're
I'm
at
sorry.
26, 20, 25, 26.
I had the wrong damn. I had the wrong damn. My bad.
Okay. Go back to about Dominic Mirafiorte. You got anything more on him?
He was another greengrocer. I think it was a competition, and
Okay, wait a minute. Start off with saying his whole name, and then just talk about him getting murdered.
So Dominic Marafiotti, like there was like usual, there was a grocery competition. He was a greengrocer. There's word he was leaking information, maybe on his competition, but he disappears on July 18th. July 19th, his parents, who are in Adelaide, they disappear also. They're murdered in their homes. So they had a real bone to pick with Marafiotti. He disappears, and then his parents murdered the next day in another part of Australia, in Adelaide. So,
wow, these guys are like those Sicilians, man. They start killing off your family. I tell you what, we're pretty lucky over in the United States. I think I can't think of any time anybody's ever killed anybody's family.
No.
Let alone any law enforcement people. God, that's unbelievable. I guess they had a lot more. I'm not sure, not control placed on them, but they carried those traditions from Sicily and southern Italy and from back in the day to over to Australia with them. Boy,
you do see guys historically like Anastasia who would overstep and kill, and that led to their downfall. When he stepped out and killed. But they didn't go after families after all.
They didn't go after families at all.
No.
That's unbelievable. I see this Benvenuto. He was one of their Melbourne bosses. Had his car bombed while he was parked there at the market. So there must have been a little bit of a war going on there in the later 80s.
There's an interview with him. He said, I don't know who would bomb it. It was probably a mistake. I think the gasoline was leaking. He telling the news.
Really? I see.
Telling the anchor person that. That's a funny clip.
Yeah, that is a funny one. So the Italians the police are really getting into them now. They even asked for help from Italy, huh?
Yeah, and it was we were doing about the same thing in the 80s, weren't we, here in America? And,
that might have been actually after Flossie. If you guys listen to my interview of Leon Flossie, and he talked about how he was the legal attaché for the FBI to Rome in the 80s, and he set up the first Italian FBI task force, and they would have Italian policemen and then Giuseppe Falcone, the judge, come over for training and just to get to know FBI agents. And then FBI agents would go over to Sicily and they started working together, which was, that was one thing that they always depended on, is nobody was working together.
Yeah.
They can do something in one place, but then go to the other place and nobody really is working together and doesn't know what's going on in the other place. So they must have probably maybe on the following the footsteps of Flossie, they started coordinating with the Italian police. I see that they also discovered some Drangheta codes of rituals.
Yeah, they discovered
Adelaide.
And that was another sort of a throwback to what happened in the 20s.
Right. But that stuff's important. Police depend on, like, the public for support for these kinds of investigations. They depend on politicians, and when you can show, you talk about this thing out here, this organization that is creating you problems, and you ask for more resources and put more energy into that, then you've got to convince people, the holders of the purse strings, that you need more assets, you need more resources, you need more people to go work on these organizations. And sometimes it's hard to convince them. I worked on a black group one time, and we just were kind of getting into it, and we had this sketchy information that there was this little organization going on, and they were getting into cocaine, and they had a crew of bank robbers working, and we had several bank robberies, and a guy got stopped one time, and it found something like it was a rules for belonging to this organization written out in pencil and paper. I remember it scratched out in a piece of tablet paper and with a pencil. But that kind of got everybody's attention, like, oh, and because this guy's name was Calvin Bradley, and he was part of it. and he was suspected to be part of this kind of a heroin organization. This was just before cocaine and bank robberies, and with even like a couple of brothers that were bosses, and so that those things are important when you find that to make your case to put more assets into an investigation.
It goes to show how organized the guys really are. You think,
Right.
well, are they just a loose conglomeration of criminals? But when they've got their own rules, I guess that would teach you that y'all really need to step up. That they're much more organized than you had originally thought, I guess.
That's for sure. Now, I see here in 1989 they killed another policeman. I wonder what was the deal with that? Colin Winchester, deputy chief of federal police.
He was involved. They were mapping all of the drug farms in and around Griffith. They were still working on these marijuana farms, and he had come up with a very precise map of there's this one and this one, this one,
Really?
millions of dollars. I mean, and you're talking in Australia, it's just massive land areas.
Yeah.
So if you've got farms all over the place, you're talking a huge amount of land. So it would be hard to know where everything was. This guy turns up dead, and there's sort of some back and forth. Was he or was he not killed by the Ndrangheta? Because there were just some different evidence that came out, and they ruled that he wasn't, but there was a lot of anti-Calabrian sentiment by this. And then a couple years later, recently, within the last 10 years, I believe, they've re-examined the murder, and they believe that the Ndrangheta did have something to do with it, that they sent some Wahoo who was not Australian. I can't remember the name of the guy, but they sent somebody to kill him, and it was just too much of a coincidence that the guy working on this massive map would disappear, that he would die at that time, shot in his home. So.
Yeah, and even though you take out one policeman, there's about 10 more that follow behind him, and then some. And certainly somebody that could take over his work. Nobody does anything. There are no lone rangers out there in law enforcement. There may be some individuals that do a few things on their own, but that whole TV thing about somebody out there operating on their own and not letting their boss and their coworkers know what they're doing, that doesn't really happen in real life.
And really changing the public perception of the Ndrangheta. There's a romance that's around these, sort of a romance around the mafia, and even there's a sense that even though they're bad, they're our bad guys. And once this guy was killed, they really got a lot of that negative attention, and so it really was a bad move strategically. Like you said, there was just another guy who's gonna do his work. But there's also, it really woke the public up to where cops are getting killed in 1989. It really changed public perception against the Ndrangheta.
So now we've, by the end of the 80s and the early 90s, they've got total control of the Melbourne wholesale market. They're extorting millions of dollars from large corporations who are buying their produce, and that they're all involved in that produce business. There's a couple of brothers here. What was the deal with Frank and Tony Metafree?
Yeah, well, the Menabry brothers, Tony he came to Australia early, and he established a presence in the market. He was a millionaire with his grocery things. Frank was really more steeped in the traditions of the Ndrangheta. He was in Calabria. He was charged with a kidnapping over there. He was really earning his stripes on the home front before he was sent to Australia. And then you get the sense that he was sent to Australia. His brother sort of laid the foundation for a good living, and Frank was sent to really take over from the bosses back home. He was sent to really be they want to get more local guys there, and Frank was sort of sent to oversee Melbourne around this time. And that Frank Benvenuto, who had been the boss for a long time, he's killed, and eventually, and Frank will take over. But I think they were grooming Frank, is what you see. He was really being groomed from back home to take over the Melbourne area. He was sent for a reason.
Yeah, I see there's several murders in the early 90s. There's a Tony Peluso, Alphonse Muratore, There is Jeffrey Bowen. He was another detective that was killed.
Yeah, that Muratore was the son-in-law of the boss at the time, the Benvenuto, the Libore. He was cheating on his daughter, which was accepted. These guys have girlfriends, but
Yeah,
he tried to divorce the boss's daughter and move in with his girlfriend, which is, I mean, these guys don't go for divorce.
and really.
Uh,
In that documentary about the big trial on Tommaso Buscetta, that was Salvatore Reina. That was he took the stand to testify, and he talked to the court about what a horrible person that Tommaso Buscetta was, because he had been married several times. He'd been married 3 times, and he
yeah.
was morally corrupt, and you should not believe anything that he said.
There's a in Goodfellas, they even touch on that. He's like, "What, are you going to get a divorce? We're not animali. We're not animals. You're going to get a
Yeah,
divorce." It was
yeah.
really, there was a lot of traditional values. I guess you could say these guys are really liberal about who you could murder and what crimes you could get into. But when it came with something like traditional, like
I
marriage,
know.
they were very conservative.
Well, one of the little anomalies, I think there's a word for that. I can't remember what it is, that you do one thing and would say another. But this policeman, Jeffrey Bowen, killed in 1994. Now, he was working on these guys
Mhm.
on the marijuana operation. Man, he must have had a hell of a marijuana operation going.
It sounds like it. There's just millions and millions of dollars worth. So he was going to testify. Those Perry brothers, Dominic and Francesco Perry, that Perry family is one of the old families there. So that's where you see the generations and the generations of guys. And he disappears. That $40 million worth of marijuana was worth of actual plants. They hadn't harvested it yet. And 13 guys were arrested. So I think this Jeffrey Bowen, they don't seem to have any function about killing a cop, as we've said, and they got him.
It's kind of an interesting little story. Now we're up around 2000. This Frank Metaferri, who had come over from Calabria, come over from Italy, and basically taken over the family. And they've got an attorney working with them by this time, a Joseph Aquaro, who works with them on the political front. You can't have a good crime family that doesn't have really good political connections.
Yeah, that's right.
The police are working like crazy on these guys, and they even get Frank deported.
Yeah, they had that order of deportation, and that was really, he had overstayed his visa when he initially came from Calabria. He had overstayed his visa by 12 years. I mean, we got to pay attention to it anyway. But so he had that deportation order hanging over his head. That was the one way they could get him. I guess with Al Capone, it was the taxes, and with this Medafri, it was the deportation order. So that was where they were trying to go with it. That was a big deal for them.
Yeah, they used to try that in the United States. As a matter of fact, that's why that's how that young policeman from New York got killed. He was going over to Sicily to get backgrounds on people to show that they didn't keep records back in 1915 or 1910, whatever, like they do today. You couldn't just jump on a computer and going over trying to find records to show people were born in Sicily and they had no real documents and didn't really come through the correct way, so they could deport him. And they found out he was over there doing that. And Joe Petrosino was his name.
Petrosino,
and they killed him while he was over there doing that. So whatever happened with this deportation then?
This is where you really see the power these guys have developed. So Tony Medafri was the one who was more making connections. So they start reaching out to the Liberal Party politicians, and I don't know liberal, I don't know anything about Australian parties, so I'm not trying to cast aspersions. But in this case, it was the Liberal Party, and they start making donations and holding fundraisers and raising $15,000 for this one and $10,000 for this one. There was an immigration party minister in the Liberal Party named Amanda Vanstone. And they had a fundraiser for her, and they raised quite a bit of money. So when she is elected and she takes over, she invalidates the deportation order. She just throws it out. And that was a major scandal. because it was in a lot of the news. These guys, they made political connections and had a deportation order on the big mob boss, who was known to be the mob boss. They had it thrown out. It took them several years to do it, but they had it thrown out. And in between all of this, you see this huge cocaine shipments coming in and all these things. So he's running his business, but when a deportation order was thrown out in a very public way by a judge, that's really showing, and I think it woke up a lot of people to the actual power that they have and how corruptible officials could be.
Yeah, they do. I see they're shipping cocaine, tons and tons and tons of it from Colombia through Italy down to Australia. That's a heck of a long shipping route, isn't it? I mean, they can't really, from Colombia's on the Atlantic side, so you have to go around through Panama.
Yeah.
You don't want to go through Panama. It's such a choke point. And you don't want to go around the Cape down there, so you got to go clear across the Atlantic up into the Mediterranean and then on to actually then the Suez Canal. Or I wonder if they stayed south and went around the Cape of Good Hope? I mean, I always find that kind of interesting, the geography of that, how you get from Colombia to Australia.
Yeah, those international shipping routes, we don't really, I guess that they had the more control coming in and going out, they hiding in tomatoes and stuff like we've seen. But they brought it to the home front and probably distributed. They were probably shipping it back in a massive shipment to spread throughout Europe, and what they had left over, they shipped down to Australia once they had divided it up.
So if they went through Italy, you have to think that they might have gone down through the Suez Canal, I guess, and then around, rather than back out to the Mediterranean and around to. Of course, they didn't get, a lot of the ship probably stayed in Italy and Europe, and maybe they had enough they could fly it or something from. I don't really know I don't know much about their drug routes here. I know a lot about them here, but not. I couldn't
really find. I know that Australia's got major ports, and so I there was a shipping container, but
so it was a shipping container.
It was an actual shipping container. So I think that would probably be easier than the plane. But I know they were bringing a lot of stuff into Australia by planes also. That was how they did the heroin.
Yeah.
So I think they were every out that they could.
Yeah, heroin on planes from Southeast Asia would be kind of a no-brainer. That would be, and heroin doesn't take up quite so much space as cocaine. And of course, marijuana takes up. They were growing their own marijuana, so you didn't really have to ship the marijuana.
Yeah.
Well, that leads us on to the big bust, one of the biggest bust ever of ecstasy
in the world.
July of 2007, 4 tons of ecstasy hidden in a shipping container that was filled with canned tomatoes from Calabria. Now, that's the way they were using those cans of tomatoes to hide the heroin in, to take it to the Pizza Connection.
It's a connection,
in the United States. They also used pallets of Italian marble and then hollowed out the middle and put the heroin down the middle. There's probably ought to go back and see how much Italian marble came in at about the same time. You probably find just another 4 tons of ecstasy. But if you remember, folks, I said, remember that name Barbaro, and this goes clear back to, turn of the century or 1920s when they first came over here. Well, they're still here. The Barbaros, there's Pasquale Barbaro, and he was a young guy at the time. He was like in his 20s, set up this shipment, and he was working for our boy Frank Meneferi.
Yeah, so that was, and if that's what they caught, I wonder what they didn't.
Yeah, oh yeah. Whatever you catch is the tip of the iceberg. I know that for sure.
What we really, we should definitely touch base is between the 90s and the 2000s, there was a major gang war in Melbourne, and these were not the Italians. They were on the periphery maybe, but it was called the Painters and Dockers Union, the Painties and Dockies. Yeah. And they had a war amongst themselves for a lot of ecstasy and things, but that war really wiped out a good 20 guys in the underworld. And in the wake of that, once they took out guys like Carl Williams and and really wiped out the painters and dockers. This is where the Ndrangheta, they really filled in the vacuum, took over the ecstasy shipping, and that was really what they had the Moran family and Carl Williams were two guys who were at war over ecstasy. Once they're all wiped out, the Ndrangheta just fills in the back, and it's right around 2006 is when the mob war was over, and there would have been a shortage of ecstasy, and that's where the Sicilians, they pick up the slack. I mean, the Calabrians pick up the slack.
Interesting. That's why they had such a huge amount, and I didn't really realize that.
Yeah, that was a real big deal, that mob war. But once you let the competition wipe out itself, you've got the market cornered.
Yeah. To get Frank Metaferi on this bus, somebody must have been doing some talking. I see it wasn't this Pasquale Barbaro, because he goes down for 30 years on the deal.
Yeah. I know there was a lot of police follow up. That's how they got this XT, and I know they had a lot of recordings set up, a lot of the wires set up, a lot of the traditional police work. And if I recall correctly, it might have just been good police work. I know there was some talk that this Aquero was talking, but he was Calabrian also. So I really couldn't find how they tracked him down. I didn't get into it as much, but it took them about 3 years, and they did nail it.
Yeah, well, however it was, they probably had to keep it on the down low. Either that, or they just, sometimes you just get lucky. I once trashed a couple of guys that moved into Kansas City from Los Angeles, and it was when we were having a lot of young gangbangers come out from Los Angeles to the different mid-sized cities in the United States and bringing their cocaine connections along with them. And so we knew these guys were in town, and I found out where they lived, and it really wasn't too far from my house. So one night I was on my way home from somewhere else, and I drove out and back, and there was this truck that we knew that they'd been driving around. So the next Monday, we got the trash people to let us use their trash truck, and we snagged their trash, and there was 2 or 3 empty kilo cocaine wrappers in there with Spanish writing on everything. So we hit them with a search warrant. We just got lucky, man. And we didn't get a big drug bust, but we did okay, and they left town right after that.
There you go. Yeah, I don't know about just throwing away the cocaine, the kilo wrappers in the trash can.
Yeah, really. I bet they didn't do that again. Of course, I don't know if they ever saw the probable cause on that search warrant or not. It's kind of hard. You got to write the probable cause when you serve a search warrant, and that's always public knowledge, because you got to file it with the court, and people can easily get that. And we didn't have any other probable cause other than I found some of their information, like a light bill and the cocaine wrappers in the trash, and we tested a little bit up the cocaine wrapper and said, yeah, that was cocaine.
You going through trash probably reveals quite a bit. I mean, throughout the years, that's something y'all did. Y'all used a lot.
It can. It's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. Yeah, it can help you. I got I didn't ever take him down. I tried to make him into an informant. I found out a new bookie that was in town, and so I hit his trash, and he had scribblings and notes and everything and he would have like all 14 games written down with different numbers next to it. So it's a bookie. So I go confront him, and he couldn't figure out how I knew. He was new in town from Texas, and I'd gotten a tip from a Texas policeman that said, hey, this guy's a bookie, and I heard he moved to Kansas City. And I checked him, and I found him and found his house, and we got that paperwork. And so I confronted him. I even talked about there's enough in there to make it look like there's some losses that week, and I can't remember exactly what it was. And he's like, I knew his eyes were like bugging out of his head. And he said, well, let me think about it. And what was funny, he didn't live that far from me, and I ran into him at the grocery store about 2 weeks later, and he'd never called me back. And I said, hey, Pat, how you doing, buddy? And he's like, oh, well. And he said, he said, I figured out how you knew what I was up to. I said, what do you mean? He said, I came home one day, and the trash was gone. and everybody else's trash was there. It's like, oh shit, I should have replaced the trash. After that, I always replaced the bag with another bag, or commandeered a trash truck. Those trash guys, you got to be careful with them. They might turn around and rat you out.
Yeah, garbage is where the mob's all involved. So
Yeah.
shit.
So usually we would just run and snag it, and people wouldn't pay much attention. But after that, I'd just take another bag of trash, get the same color bag and dump it down, and then grab their bag of trash and take it off somewhere.
It's creative police work.
So this is a power struggle going on, and they're still there today. I'm sure they're still in charge of all drugs in Australia, wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah, I'm sure that you see even Modafferi goes down, and Tony Modafferi, his brother, is still there, and he's more, he appears to be more legitimate, and he's still running things. And that Joseph Aguero, they had a little dust up between them, and he was murdered. That was a big one too. This
that was real recent, wasn't it?
Attorney, yeah, that was. You're right.
Yeah, well, that was their attorney that had helped get that deportation overturned. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that in 2016, you see a major mob lawyer that I guess probably kind of like an Oscar Goodman type, but he was also Colombian, and he's shot to death in the streets. And they say, maybe he owed some money, maybe he didn't, but I think he was making a move. A lot of these guys you see wiped out just in the last couple of years. I mean, like you said, that Pascal Barbaro, that was in 2016. This Aguero was 2016. 2016 was a big year for dead Calabrians in Australia.
Oh, interesting. Well, we'll have to keep an eye out for them. I keep put in a couple of these names in my Google search thing. So if there's any news that pops up, then it'll pop up in my.
That's right.
They'll send me an email that says that I've got that. I do that on my own name, and there's a chief of police for Pullman, Oregon, and he's always getting in the newspapers. That's only once in a great while, some news report, be some kind of article that'll have my name in it, but mainly it's the chief of police of Pullman, Oregon says something. I got Lefty Rosenthal in there. I need to take him out. Tony Spilotro. Now there's a reporter named Tony Spilotro. I need to take that one out too. He's long dead. I need to put some new names in there.
That's right.
Folks, there's a great documentary out there, but you can only find half of it, it seems like. It's on, you just Google Australian organized crime mafia, not Google it, but on YouTube. Some of these terms we've used, and I'll have some of the correct spellings of these names in my show notes, and see if you can't find that. I'll try to find it and put a link to it on my show notes.
It's called I think it's like a Dateline type show over in Australia. I don't know. It's
called Four Corners, isn't it?
Yeah, Four Corners. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, and
I'll find a link to that. Cam had sent me a link to it, and I watched it, and I'll find a link to that.
Yeah, that was a hell of a good show. I guess like you said, there's two parts, but part one is it really gives you a lot of the information, and two would have been. You can learn a lot.
All right, Cam, you got anything else to say about the Australian Drangheta?
No, I think that it was a really good idea for us to jump into them. I really liked picking up and learned a lot. As he said, I've seen stuff about the Melbourne War and all, but the Drangheta is really interesting to see their evolution in Australia. I really it was a really good show. It was a really good topic idea suggested.
All right, great. Well, we have to thank our Australian friend, lawyer, and raconteur Dan Bashford down in Sydney, or is it Melbourne? I think it's Sydney. Also, I forgot, Dan. I apologize.
You said Sydney.
Sydney. I got too many thoughts in my head sometimes. I can't keep it all apart. So we wish y'all luck down there in Australia, and you're a lot more spread out than we are, so probably not so much social distancing when you get out in the outback. You probably don't have to worry too much about catching the COVID unless some strangers come into town. You probably look at them with a jaundiced eye, I would imagine.
They have olive skin and black hair out of it.
All right, Cam. If you're a veteran and believe you have problems that might be from PTSD connected to your service time, call your local vet center or hospital in your area. There's a national hotline, 1-800-273-8255, and press 1 if you're a vet, or go to www.ptsd.va.gov. The site has a lot of good resources on it. Don't forget, hit me up on the Venmo app. It's Gangland. Buy me a cup of coffee or a shot in a beer. I got my 2 movies out there you can rent for $1.99 on Amazon, Brothers Against Brothers, The Sabella Spiro War, or Gangland Wire. Got my book out there, Leaving Vegas, How FBI Wiretaps Ended Mob Domination of Las Vegas Casinos. And Cam, you got anything else you want to say?
No, I can't speak highly enough about your documentary, both of them. If you want to see the footage and you want to get the story from a guy who was right in the middle of it, you really can't beat Brothers Against Brothers and Gangland Wire. You just really from a guy who was in the middle of it, you really can't beat him.
All right, thank you, Cam. Good night, folks. Good night, Cam.
Hi, Gary.